Milk is treated as a nutritional certainty in modern America. It is taught in schools subsidized by policy and marketed as the foundation of strong bones for an entire lifetime. Yet buried in agricultural records and nutritional analyses is a contradiction so uncomfortable that it quietly disappeared from public conversation. For centuries, people across Europe relied on a wild plant, classified today as a weed, that contains more calcium by dry weight than milk ever did. It grew without barns, without animals, without refrigeration, and without supply chains. And it fed people through periods when dairy collapsed entirely. During the Napoleonic Wars, and again throughout the First and Second World Wars, dairy production across large parts of Europe fell by more than half due to fodder shortages and transport disruption. In response, communities returned to plants they had relied on long before industrial agriculture. One of them was stinging nettle. Historical food records from Scandinavia, Britain, and Central Europe show nettle soups and dried nettle powders used as mineral sources when milk was unavailable. Laboratory analysis conducted in the 20th century confirmed why. When dried nettle leaves contain roughly 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams more than what is found in milk powder, this presents a problem. If a plant that grows freely requires no animals and no ongoing purchases can rival or exceed milk as a calcium source, then the story we were told about nutritional progress begins to crack. And the question is no longer whether this plant worked. The question is why a solution that once kept populations alive was quietly reclassified as irrelevant. The plant at the center of this contradiction is stinging nettle, scientifically known as Urtica dioica. Today it is something most Americans are taught to avoid. It stings on contact, spreads aggressively, and is routinely sprayed cut or pulled out wherever it appears. In modern agricultural language, nettle is not described as food, it is described as a weed. That label alone has been enough to remove it from serious consideration. But historically, that label did not exist. Before the 20th century, nettle appeared regularly in European herbals farm manuals and household cookbooks. In Britain, records from the 18th and 19th centuries describe nettle as one of the first spring greens harvested after winter shortages. In Germany and Austria, dried nettle leaf was ground and stored as a mineral supplement. In Scandinavia, it was used not only as food, but as livestock feed when hay was scarce. The plant was not marginal. It was familiar, managed, and intentionally used. What changed was not the biology of the plant. Stinging nettle did not suddenly lose nutrients or become unsafe. What changed was classification. As industrial agriculture expanded, crops were selected based on uniformity, scalability, and profit potential. Plants that grew everywhere required no inputs and could not be controlled by seed catalogs or supply chains slowly disappeared from official systems. Nettle became something to eradicate rather than understand. Once it was labeled a weed, it stopped being measured, taught, and remembered as food. To understand why stinging nettle was once trusted as a mineral source, the comparison has to be made correctly. Milk is mostly water. Fresh milk is nearly 90% liquid, which means its nutrients are diluted by volume. Plants are similar when fresh, but when they are dried, the water is removed, and the minerals remain concentrated. This is why historical comparisons were made using dry weight, not fresh servings. When nettle leaves are harvested and dried, they become dense with minerals stored from the soil. Modern laboratory analyses conducted across Europe and North America in the 20th century consistently measured dried nettle leaf at roughly 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams. By comparison, milk powder contains significantly less calcium by the same dry weight measurement. This does not mean that drinking milk is ineffective. It means that gram for gram the mineral density of dried nettle leaf is higher. The reason this matters is efficiency. For people living before refrigeration, calcium was not consumed as a beverage habit. It was obtained from whatever source delivered the most nutrition with the least effort and spoilage. Dried nettle could be harvested once, stored for months, and added to soups or breads as needed. No animals had to be fed. No daily milking was required. No cold storage was necessary. This is not alternative theory. It is basic chemistry. Calcium does not disappear when a plant dries. Water does. And when water is removed, concentration increases. The data has been available for decades. What disappeared was not the evidence, but the incentive to keep teaching it. Long before nutrition labels and fortified products existed, stinging nettle earned its place through necessity. During periods of famine and war, when supply chains failed and livestock numbers collapsed, nettle was not a last resort. It was a planned response. In Central Europe, written records from the early 19th century show nettle being gathered and dried in anticipation of food shortages. During the Napoleonic Wars, when blockades disrupted grain and dairy transport across the continent, nettle soups became common in rural regions of France, Germany, and the Alpine states. The plant reappears again in archival accounts from the First World War, particularly in Austria and Scandinavia, where civilian populations faced prolonged rationing. During the Second World War, Britain's Ministry of Food actively promoted the use of wild greens to supplement rations. Nettle was included in public guidance pamphlets as an acceptable and nutritious ingredient. At the same time, German agricultural reports documented the use of nettle meal as both human food and animal feed when conventional inputs were unavailable. These were not isolated anecdotes. They were coordinated responses by governments and communities under pressure. What is important is not that nettle replaced milk entirely, but that it filled a critical gap when milk could not be produced, transported, or stored. It provided minerals when bones still needed support, and children were still growing. The plant's role was practical, repeatable, and scalable without infrastructure. When historians examine how populations survived extended scarcity, nettle appears not as folklore, but as a quiet constant. The turning point did not come from new discoveries about nutrition, it came from infrastructure. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, dairy changed from a local practice into an industrial system. Refrigeration, rail transport, and later interstate highways made it possible to move milk long distances before it spoiled. At the same time, governments began to treat dairy as a strategic commodity. In the United States, federal price supports and school milk programs were introduced in the 1930s and expanded after the Second World War. By the 1950s, milk was no longer just food. It was policy, industry, and identity. Once dairy became industrialized, nutrition education followed the system that could be standardized and monetized. Milk could be measured, packaged, branded, and sold repeatedly. A cow had to be fed every day. Equipment had to be purchased. Refrigeration had to be maintained. Every step created an economic loop. Stinging nettle did not. It grew without permission, without inputs, and without contracts. It could not be patented or controlled. From the perspective of an industrial food system, that was not an advantage, it was a liability. As dairy solidified its place, wild and self-propagating foods quietly fell out of curricula. Agricultural extension services stopped teaching their use. Nutrition charts focused on products that could be consistently delivered to millions of people through centralized supply chains. Nettle did not disappear because it failed a test. It disappeared because it did not fit the model that had replaced survival with scalability. There was no announcement declaring stinging nettle obsolete. No law banned it. No study disproved its value. Its disappearance followed a quieter pattern that repeated across modern agriculture. Once food systems became centralized, only what could be standardized remained visible. Crops that required management, packaging, and repeat purchases stayed in the system. Anything that could be gathered freely grown without inputs or passed down through informal knowledge simply faded from official channels. This is what structural suppression looks like. Universities stopped researching plants that offered no commercial return. Agricultural extension programs focused on crops that supported equipment sales, seed contracts, and chemical inputs. Nutrition education narrowed to foods that could be reliably distributed through industrial supply chains. None of this required intent. It only required alignment with incentives. Stinging nettle had no industry to defend it, no lobby to fund studies, and no marketing budget to keep it visible. The label weed completed the process. Once a plant is defined as undesirable, it stops being examined. It stops being measured. It stops being taught. Children learn to pull it out, not ask what it contains. Over time, absence becomes normal. Knowledge that was once common turns into curiosity, then into obscurity. The system does not need to erase it. It only needs to stop mentioning it. By the time modern nutrition charts were standardized in the mid-20th century, nettle was already gone from the conversation. Not because it was disproven, but because it was no longer useful to the structure that decided what counted as food. For older Americans, this shift was not abstract. It unfolded gradually across a lifetime. Many grew up closer to food production when gardens were common and knowledge passed informally between generations. Over time, that relationship was replaced with dependency on packaged solutions, fortified products, and expert guidance. Calcium became something purchased, prescribed, and monitored rather than something understood. With age comes a new awareness of fragility. Bones weaken, medical costs rise, diet becomes a subject of concern rather than habit. The response offered by the modern system is almost always the same: consume more products, add supplements, trust the pipeline. Very few people are encouraged to ask whether simpler sources were once sufficient or whether something was lost along the way. Stinging nettle matters here not as a recommendation but as a mirror. It represents a moment when nutrition was local, adaptable, and resilient. It challenges the assumption that progress always moves in one direction. For a generation that has watched systems grow larger, more complex, and more expensive, the question becomes personal. How much knowledge was replaced by convenience, and how much independence disappeared without being noticed? This is not about rejecting modern food or medicine. It is about recognizing that dependency was not inevitable. Other paths existed. Some were abandoned not because they failed, but because they did not scale into profit. For people who have lived long enough to see multiple cycles of promise and disappointment, that realization carries weight. At this point, the question can no longer stay abstract. If a plant that grows on its own requires no animals, no refrigeration, and no ongoing purchases once provided mineral support comparable to milk, then its disappearance forces a choice. Either progress naturally replaced something inferior, or efficiency was traded for control. Both cannot be true at the same time. One interpretation says this loss was necessary, the cost of feeding millions through centralized systems. The other suggests that something valuable was pushed aside simply because it could not be owned, branded, or sold again and again. This is where the viewer has to decide. If you believe that removing self-sufficient food sources in favor of industrial products was an improvement, then the system worked exactly as intended. But if you believe that knowledge which sustained people through wars, shortages, and collapse should not vanish without question, then something important was lost, not banned, not disproven, just quietly left behind. So here is the line that divides opinion. If you agree that stinging nettle represents a forgotten solution, not a primitive mistake, comment the number 9 below. If you disagree, if you believe this comparison is flawed or irrelevant today, do not comment at all. Instead, like the video to show that you reject this idea. Either way, the response matters. Silence is not neutral here. It only reinforces the forgetting. The story does not end with disappearance. Stinging nettle never vanished from the land. It still grows along fences, riverbanks, and forgotten edges of fields. The plant did not fail. The soil did not forget it. Only the system stopped paying attention. The measurements are still there. The historical records still exist. Nothing about its biology has changed. What changed was what we were encouraged to remember. Modern food systems reward complexity, ownership, and repetition. Simple solutions that do not require permission rarely survive that transition. But buried knowledge does not expire. It waits, sometimes for decades, sometimes for generations, And when conditions shift, it resurfaces exactly as it was before, unchanged by neglect. This channel exists to examine those moments, not to reject modern systems, but to question the assumption that newer always means better. If this story changed how you see a plant you once ignored, subscribe to the channel. Each episode opens another vault, another piece of knowledge that worked long before it was convenient to forget it. The next one is already waiting.